Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your father has just sold you, not your belongings, not your labor, you, your entire existence, your body, your future children, your very soul, all of it handed over to a complete stranger for a handful of silver coins and a promise of political alliance. Asterisk, you're not livestock, you're not property, you're a human being with dreams, fears, and desires, but in medieval Europe, if you were born a woman, none of that mattered. You were nothing more than a commodity to be traded, a breeding vessel to be purchased, a political pawn to be sacrificed on the altar of male ambition. Asterisk, what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core. The systematic dehumanization of women in medieval society wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of the times. It was a carefully orchestrated system designed to strip away every shred of human dignity from half the population. And the worst part, most people today have no idea just how horrific it really was. This is the story that they don't want you to know. The story of how medieval wives were literally sold like cattle. And why understanding this dark chapter of our past is more important now than ever before. Asterisk, let's start with a scene that would make your blood run cold. Picture this. It's 1347 and we're standing in the marketplace of a typical English town. Honest merchants hawk their wares: fresh bread, fine cloth, sturdy tools. But there's another kind of transaction happening here, one that involves no goods or services, but human lives. Asterisk, over there, by the fountain, two men shake hands. They've just concluded a business deal. One man, let's call him Lord Geoffrey, has agreed to give his 13-year-old daughter, Marguerite, to the other man, Sir William, in exchange for 300 acres of land, 50 head of cattle, and a promise of military support in his ongoing border dispute. Marguerite stands between them, silent and trembling. She has never met Sir William before this moment. She knows nothing about him except that he's 43 years old, twice widowed, and that he needs a young wife to bear him sons. She doesn't know that his previous wives both died in childbirth. She doesn't know about his violent temper or his drinking. She doesn't know that she'll spend the next 20 years of her life, if she's lucky enough to survive that long, as little more than a prisoner in his castle. Asterisk, but here's the thing that will absolutely destroy you. This wasn't considered tragic. This wasn't seen as wrong or immoral or barbaric. This was Tuesday. This was normal. This was how society functioned. Asterisk, the medieval system of marriage wasn't about love, companionship, or even basic human compatibility. It was a sophisticated economic and political machine designed to consolidate power, transfer wealth, and ensure the continuation of bloodlines. And women were simply the fuel that kept this machine running. Let me paint you a picture of what this really meant. When a noble family had a daughter born, they didn't celebrate the arrival of a new person into the world. They calculated her potential market value. They assessed her breeding prospects. They considered which political alliances she might facilitate. From the moment she drew her first breath, she wasn't seen as a human being with inherent worth and dignity. She was an investment, a commodity, a thing to be eventually sold to the highest bidder. Asterisk, the language they used reveals everything. Marriage negotiations were conducted using the same terminology as livestock trading. A bride's bloodline was evaluated like a mare's pedigree. Her breeding potential was assessed like a cow's milk production capacity. Her value was calculated based on her father's wealth, her physical attributes, and her ability to produce male heirs. Asterisk, the legal framework of medieval Europe didn't just allow this system, it enforced it with brutal efficiency. Under the doctrine of coverture, which governed marriage law across most of medieval Europe, a woman legally ceased to exist the moment she said "I do." Her legal identity was completely absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property. She couldn't enter contracts. She couldn't even make medical decisions about her own body. Asterisk, think about that for a moment. Imagine being erased so completely that the law doesn't even recognize you as a person anymore. Imagine having your entire existence reduced to three functions: producing children, managing a household, and satisfying your husband's desires. Imagine living every day knowing that you are, in the eyes of society and law, nothing more than a sophisticated piece of property. Asterisk, the marriage ceremony itself was a grotesque parody of choice and consent, while modern weddings celebrate the union of two people choosing to build a life together. Medieval weddings were elaborate property transfer ceremonies. The bride's father would literally give away his daughter, not in the symbolic sense we know today, but in the literal, legal sense of transferring ownership of one human being to another. The wedding vows reflected this horrific reality. While the groom promised to love and cherish his new wife, the bride's vows were far more revealing. She promised to love, honor, and obey, with special emphasis on that final word, obey, like a well-trained animal, like a servant bound in perpetual servitude, like a thing that exists solely to fulfill another's will. Asterisk, but perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire system was how thoroughly it brainwashed its victims. Generation after generation of women were raised from birth to believe that their primary purpose in life was to serve as vessels for men's ambitions. They were taught that their own desires, dreams, and aspiration were not just unimportant but actually sinful and selfish. Asterisk, young girls were conditioned from their earliest memories to see themselves as inherently inferior, naturally subordinate, and completely dependent on male authority. They were told that questioning this system was tantamount to rebelling against God himself, since the church taught that women's subjugation was divinely ordained punishment for Eve's original sin. Can you imagine the psychological torture of growing up in such a world? Can you fathom the crushing weight of being told every single day of your life that you matter only insofar as you can serve others? Can you conceive of the despair of knowing that your thoughts, feelings, and desires are not just irrelevant but actively dangerous? Asterisk, this brings us to our first story, the tale of a young woman whose experience perfectly encapsulates the horror of medieval marriage markets. Her name was Eleanor de Montfort, and her story will break your heart in ways you never thought possible. But before we dive into Eleanor's tragic tale, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear is not just historically disturbing, it's profoundly relevant to struggles we're still fighting today. The attitudes and systems that destroyed Eleanor's life didn't just disappear with the medieval period. They evolved, adapted, and continue to influence how our society views women's autonomy and worth. Asterisk, are you ready to confront this darkness? Are you prepared to understand just how deep these roots of oppression run? Because once you hear Eleanor's story, you'll never be able to look at the history of women's rights the same way again. Asterisk, Eleanor de Montfort was born in 1252 into one of England's most powerful noble families. Her father, Simon de Montfort, was the Earl of Leicester and one of the most influential political figures of his time. By all accounts, Eleanor was intelligent, well-educated, and possessed what medieval chroniclers described as uncommon beauty. And asterisk, but none of those qualities mattered when it came time to determine her fate. What mattered was her bloodline, her father's political connections, and most importantly her potential to produce male heirs for whatever family was willing to pay the highest price for her. Asterisk, Eleanor's nightmare began when she was just 11 years old. That's when her father first began entertaining marriage proposals, not from young men who might court her or show interest in her personality. No, these were business propositions from older men, political allies, and foreign dignitaries who saw her as a means to an end. Asterisk, the first serious offer came from Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the Prince of Wales. He was 34 years old, more than 3 times Eleanor's age. He had never met her, never spoken to her, and never shown the slightest interest in her as a person, but he needed an English alliance. and Eleanor's father needed Welsh support for his political ambitions. The negotiations were conducted exactly like a livestock transaction. Llewellyn's representatives assessed Eleanor's breeding potential based on her mother's reproductive history. They examined her physical development to ensure she would be capable of bearing children. They evaluated her father's wealth to determine what dowry would accompany the marriage. But here's the detail that will absolutely devastate you. Eleanor had no idea any of this was happening. While grown men negotiated the sale of her body and future, she was playing with dolls and learning to embroider. She was still a child, blissfully unaware that her entire life had already been planned out without her input or consent. The final agreement was struck when Eleanor turned 13. The terms were as follows. Lord Simon would provide a dowry of 500 marks, equivalent to roughly $2.5 million in today's money. Llewellyn would gain not just a wife, but a political alliance with one of England's most powerful families. And Eleanor would be shipped off to Wales like a piece of cargo, to spend the rest of her life with a man she had never met, in a country she had never seen, speaking a language she didn't understand. But the story gets even darker. The marriage contract included specific clauses about Eleanor's performance expectations. She was required to produce an heir within 3 years of the wedding. If she failed to do so, Llewellyn had the legal right to annul the marriage and send her back to her father in disgrace. If she produced only daughters, she would be considered to have partially fulfilled her obligations, but would face increasing pressure with each passing year. Think about the psychological torture embedded in these terms. A 13-year-old girl was being told that her worth as a human being would be measured solely by her ability to produce male children. Her success or failure in life would be determined not by her intelligence, kindness, talents, or character, but by biological processes completely beyond her control. The wedding preparations began immediately. Eleanor was subjected to what can only be described as conditioning designed to break her spirit and reshape her into the compliant vessel her future husband expected. She was given lessons in wifely obedience, taught to keep her eyes downcast when speaking to men, and trained to respond to commands without question or hesitation. Medieval marriage manuals from this period, yes, they actually existed, provide horrifying insights into what Eleanor was being prepared for. One popular guide, the Book of the Knight of the Tower, advised young brides to be humble and submissive in all things, to never contradict your husband, even when he is wrong, and to accept whatever treatment he deems appropriate, for it is your duty to endure. Another manual, written by a French nobleman for his own daughters, included this chilling advice. Remember that you are your husband's property, just as his horse is his property, just as he may ride his horse hard when necessary, so may he use you as he sees fit. Your comfort is less important than his convenience. Can you imagine being 13 years old and being forced to memorize those words? Can you fathom the psychological damage of being told that your value as a human being is equivalent to that of an animal? Can you conceive of the despair that must have filled Eleanor's heart as she prepared for a life of complete subjugation? But Eleanor's story takes an even more tragic turn. Just weeks before the wedding was scheduled to take place, her father was killed in the Battle of Evesham. With Simon de Montfort dead, the political alliance that had motivated the marriage was no longer valuable to Llewellyn. You might think this would have been Eleanor's salvation. You might imagine that the death of her father would have freed her from this arranged marriage and given her a chance at a different life. You would be wrong. Instead of canceling the engagement, Llewellyn's representatives renegotiated the terms. With Eleanor's father dead and her family's political power diminished, her market value had decreased significantly. The Prince of Wales now demanded a reduced dowry and additional concessions from Eleanor's surviving relatives. But the most heartbreaking part of this renegotiation was how it affected Eleanor herself. She had spent 2 years mentally preparing for marriage to Llywelyn, trying to convince herself that she could find happiness, or at least acceptance, in her predetermined fate. Now, suddenly, she was being told that she wasn't even worth the original price that had been agreed upon. Imagine the psychological devastation of being a 15-year-old girl and discovering that your value as a human being had been reduced like a merchant marking down damaged goods. Imagine the crushing realization that even in a system where you were already treated as property, you were now considered defective property. The revised marriage contract was signed in 1265. Eleanor was to be married to Llywelyn within 6 months, with a reduced dowry and additional humiliating conditions. She would be required to prove her fertility within the first year of marriage. She would have no claim to any of Llywelyn's Welsh properties, and perhaps most cruelly, she would be forbidden from maintaining any contact with her English relatives without her husband's explicit permission. Eleanor's wedding day, if you can even call it that, was a grotesque mockery of celebration. She stood at the altar in a dress that felt like a funeral shroud, reciting vows that sounded like a surrender of her very soul. When the priest pronounced her and Llywelyn husband and wife, she didn't feel joined to another person. She felt erased out. The consummation of the marriage that night was, by all historical accounts, traumatic beyond description. Eleanor was not a willing participant. She was a transaction being completed. She was not a bride experiencing intimacy with her new husband. She was property being claimed by its new owner. But here's what makes Eleanor's story so important for us to understand today. Her experience wasn't unusual or exceptional. She wasn't the victim of particularly cruel circumstances or uncommonly harsh treatment. Her story was the norm across medieval Europe. Thousands upon thousands of young women were experiencing variations of this same nightmare every single year. The systematic dehumanization that Eleanor endured wasn't a bug in the medieval system. It was a feature. It was the intended outcome of laws, customs, and religious teachings specifically designed to reduce women to reproductive vessels and economic assets. And this brings us to the question that should be keeping you awake at night. How did an entire civilization convince itself that this was not only acceptable but actually virtuous and godly? How did medieval society create such an elaborate system of justification for what was essentially the mass enslavement of half the population? The answer lies in the second part of our story, the institutional machinery that made the bride market possible. We need to understand how the church, the legal system, and social customs all work together to create an ideological framework that portrayed the buying and selling of women as not just normal but morally necessary. What you're about to discover will shake your faith in human nature itself, because the organizations and institutions that claim to represent justice, morality, and divine will were actually the architects of this system of systematic oppression. Are you ready to learn how an entire civilization became complicit in the commodification of human beings? Are you prepared to understand how supposedly moral institutions became the engines of unimaginable cruelty? Because once you see how these systems worked, you'll recognize their fingerprints all over injustices that persist to this day. If you want to understand how medieval society managed to convince itself that selling women like livestock was not only acceptable but divinely ordained, you need to understand the role of the Catholic Church. Because the Church wasn't just a passive observer of these practices, it was the primary architect and enforcer of the ideological framework that made them possible. Let me take you inside the mind of Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians in medieval Christianity. This is the man whose writings shaped church doctrine for centuries. whose philosophical arguments were used to justify the systematic oppression of women across Europe. In his masterwork, Summa Theologica, Aquinas wrote these chilling words: "Woman is naturally subject to man, because in man the discretion of reason predominates. The image of God is in man, and it is one. Woman was deceived first because she is of slighter reason." Think about what this means. The most respected theological authority in medieval Europe was literally arguing that women were mentally inferior by divine design. He was claiming that God himself had created women to be subordinate, that their supposed intellectual deficiency was not a social construct but a biological reality ordained by the creator of the universe. But Aquinas didn't stop there. He went on to argue that women's primary purpose in God's plan was reproduction, and that any attempt by women to pursue other goals or interests was tantamount to rebelling against divine will. He wrote, "The male is more perfect than the female, and the reason for this is that the male is the agent while the female is the passive recipient." Do you understand what this theological framework accomplished? It didn't just permit the treatment of women as property, it made such treatment a religious obligation. Any man who failed to control and dominate the women in his life wasn't just being negligent, he was sinning against God. Any woman who resisted this control wasn't just being difficult, she was engaging in heretical rebellion against the natural order. The Church's marriage liturgy reflected this twisted theology. While modern wedding ceremonies emphasize mutual love and partnership, medieval wedding vows were explicitly hierarchical. The bride promised to love, honor, and obey her husband, while the groom made no reciprocal promise of obedience. The bride was given away by her father like a piece of property being transferred from one owner to another. But the Church's role in this system went far beyond theological justification. Church courts had legal jurisdiction over marriage disputes, and their rulings consistently favored male authority over female autonomy. When wives complained of abuse, they were told to be more submissive. When they protested forced marriages, they were reminded that rebellion against their husbands was rebellion against God. Let me tell you about one particular case that perfectly illustrates how this system worked. In 1284, a young woman named Isabel de Clare brought a complaint to the ecclesiastical court in Canterbury. She had been forced into marriage at age 14 with a man who beat her regularly, denied her food as punishment for perceived disobedience, and threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave. The Church's response: they ruled that Isabel's suffering was the result of her own spiritual failings. The court ordered her to fast for 30 days, spend 4 hours daily in prayer asking God to make her a more obedient wife, and submit to additional discipline from her husband as penance for her complaints. When Isabel protested that she feared for her life, the presiding bishop told her that martyrdom in service of wifely duty was the highest calling a woman and could achieve. When she begged to be allowed to return to her family, she was informed that marriage was a sacrament that could not be dissolved, and that attempting to leave her husband would result in excommunication and eternal damnation. Isabel died 6 months later from injuries sustained in a beating. The Church recorded her death as God's merciful release of a troubled soul, and her husband was encouraged to remarry quickly so that he might have better success with a more spiritually mature wife. This wasn't an isolated case. Church records from across medieval Europe are filled with similar stories of women seeking help and being told that their suffering was either deserved or spiritually beneficial. The institution that claimed to represent divine love and mercy had become a machine for legitimizing and perpetuating the most horrific forms of human cruelty. But the Church wasn't working alone. The legal systems of medieval Europe were equally complicit in this systematic dehumanization. Let me walk you through how the law actually functioned when it came to women's rights, or rather, their complete lack thereof. Under the legal doctrine known as coverture, which governed marriage law across most of medieval Europe, a married woman had no legal existence whatsoever. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue or be sued. She could not make a will. She could not even make medical decisions about her own body. The legal terminology used to describe this status is revealing. Married women were referred to as femme couverte, meaning covered woman, as if marriage literally covered them with an invisibility cloak that made them disappear from the eyes of the law. Their legal identity was completely absorbed into their husbands, just as their property and even their personal belongings became his absolute property. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval marriage law was how it dealt with rape and domesty. See violence. Under the legal principle of conjugal rights, a husband had unlimited sexual access to his wife's body. The concept of marital rape didn't exist because wives were considered to have given permanent, irrevocable consent to all sexual activity at the moment they said "I do." Similarly, domestic violence was not just legal but was considered a husband's duty. Legal texts from the period explicitly state that a man who failed to correct his wife's behavior through physical punishment was failing in his responsibilities as head of household. The only legal restriction was that he shouldn't use implements thicker than his thumb, giving us the phrase rule of thumb. Can you imagine living under such a legal system? Can you fathom existing in a world where the law explicitly states that your body doesn't belong to you, where violence against you is not only permitted but encouraged, and where you have no legal recourse against even the most horrific abuse? The economic structures of medieval society reinforced this legal framework. Women were excluded from most trades and professions, making financial independence virtually impossible. Even wealthy women from noble families found their inheritances controlled by male relatives or transferred directly to their husbands upon marriage. This economic dependency wasn't accidental. It was carefully constructed to ensure that women had no choice but to accept whatever marriage arrangements were made for them. A woman who refused an arranged marriage faced not just social disgrace, but literal starvation, since she would have no means of supporting herself. The guild system that controlled medieval crafts and trades was particularly instrumental in maintaining women's economic subjugation. While there were occasional exceptions, most guilds explicitly prohibited female membership. Women were allowed to work only as assistants to their husbands or fathers, and their wages, when they received any at all, were typically half of what men earned for the same work. But here's what makes this system truly diabolical. It created the conditions that seemed to justify its own existence. By denying women education, economic opportunities, and legal rights, medieval society created a situation where women appeared to be naturally dependent on male authority. The oppression created its own evidence. When women lacked formal education, men could point to their supposed intellectual inferiority. When women had no economic power, men could argue that they were naturally suited only for domestic roles. When women had no legal standing, men could claim that they were too emotionally unstable to handle such responsibilities. This brings us to the third and final part of our story, the tale of a woman who dared to challenge this entire system and the horrific price she paid for her defiance. Her name was Marguerite Porete, and her story will show you exactly what happened to women who refused to accept their assigned role as property and breeding vessels. But I must warn you, Marguerite's fate was so brutal, so utterly designed to terrorize other women into compliance, that it reveals the true depths of medieval misogyny. What they did to her wasn't just murder, it was a public demonstration of what awaited any woman who dared to claim that she was more than just property. Are you prepared to learn what happened to women who fought back against this system? Are you ready to understand just how far medieval society was willing to go to maintain male dominance Because Margaret's story will change how you think about courage, resistance, and the price that countless women have paid for the freedoms we sometimes take for granted today. In the year 1310, in the center of Paris, a woman was burned alive for the crime of insisting that she was a human being with inherent worth and dignity. Her name was Marguerite Porete, and her execution represents one of the most chilling examples of what medieval society did to women who dared to challenge their assigned role as property. Marguerite wasn't a political revolutionary or a violent criminal. She was a theologian, a mystic, and a writer whose only crime was believing that women, like men, could have a direct relationship with God that didn't require male intermediation. She wrote a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, in which she argued that the divine spark within each person, including women, was more important than earthly hierarchies and social structures. To understand why this was so threatening to medieval authorities, you need to grasp the theological implications of Margaret's ideas. She was essentially arguing that women's souls were equal to men's souls in the eyes of God. She was suggesting that a woman's relationship with the divine was her own, not something that needed to be mediated by her father, husband, or male clergy. In a society built on the premise that women were spiritually inferior and naturally subordinate, Margaret's ideas were absolutely revolutionary. If women were truly equal souls in God's eyes, then the entire structure of medieval society, with its assumption of male dominance, was not divinely ordained but artificially constructed. The Church's response to Margaret's book was swift and brutal. In 1306, her work was declared heretical and ordered to be burned. Marguerite was commanded to stop writing, stop teaching, and stop spreading her dangerous ideas about women's spiritual equality. But here's what makes Margaret's story so extraordinary. She refused. Despite facing persecution, imprisonment, and the very real threat of execution, she continued to write, continued to teach, and continued to insist that women were more than just property to be bought and sold. The authorities' reaction reveals everything about how deeply threatened they felt by her ideas. This wasn't just theological disagreement, this was existential terror. If women started believing that they were spiritually equal to men, if they started thinking they could have direct relationships with God, if they started questioning the divine authority of male dominance, the entire social order could collapse. Marguerite was arrested in 1308 and subjected to what can only be described as psychological torture designed to break her spirit. She was held in solitary confinement for 18 months, denied adequate food and warmth, and repeatedly interrogated by teams of male theologians who demanded that she renounce her writings and confess to the sin of spiritual pride. The transcripts of these interrogations, preserved in church archives, provide a horrifying window into the medieval mindset about women who dared to think for themselves. The inquisitors didn't just question Margaret's theological positions, they attacked her very right to have theological positions. They told her repeatedly that women were incapable of understanding divine mysteries, that her writings proved she was possessed by demons, and that her refusal to submit to male authority was evidence of fundamental spiritual corruption. One particularly chilling exchange shows the inquisitor asking Marguerite, "Do you not understand that God has placed you under the authority of men for your own spiritual protection? Do you not see that your rebellion against this divine order proves your unworthiness to receive God's grace?" Margaret's response has echoed through history. "I understand that God has made me a rational soul capable of knowing and loving Him directly. I will not pretend to be less than what He has made me, even if you burn me for it." The trial that followed was a mockery of justice even by medieval standards. Marguerite was not allowed to have legal representation. She was not permitted to call witnesses in her defense. She was not even allowed to speak during most of the proceedings. Male theologians debated the fate of her soul while she sat silently, treated more like an object of study than a human being on trial for her life. The charges against her reveal the depth of medieval misogyny. She was accused of the sin of presumption for believing that a woman could understand theology. She was charged with spiritual pride for refusing to acknowledge male intellectual superiority. She was condemned for rebellion against divine order for suggesting that women's souls were equal to men's souls, but perhaps the most telling charge was corruption of other women. The court specifically noted that Marguerite's ideas were spreading among women in Paris and beyond. They pointed to evidence that women were reading her book, discussing her ideas, and beginning to question their own subjugation. This, the court declared, was the most dangerous heresy of all. The sentence was death by burning, not just as punishment for Marguerite, but as a warning to every other woman who might dare to believe that she was more than property. The execution was scheduled for June 1, 1310, in the Place de Grève, where the largest possible crowd could witness what happened to women who forgot their place. The night before her execution, church officials made one final attempt to break Marguerite's spirit. They offered her a deal if she would publicly renounce her writings, acknowledge that women were naturally inferior to men, and begged forgiveness for the sin of thinking too highly of herself. They would commute her sentence to life imprisonment. Marguerite's response was to spend the night in prayer, not begging God to save her life, but thanking Him for the privilege of suffering for truth. She wrote a final letter, smuggled out of her cell by a sympathetic guard, in which she said, "They may burn my body, but they cannot burn the truth that lives in every woman's soul. We are more than what they tell us we are." On the morning of June 1, 1310, Marguerite Porete was led to the stake. Contemporary accounts describe her as calm and dignified, showing no fear despite the horrific death that awaited her. She was offered one final chance to recant her beliefs. She refused. As the flames rose around her, witnesses reported that Marguerite continued to pray aloud, not for her own salvation, but for the women who would come after her. Her final recorded words were, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, and give courage to my sisters, who will continue this fight." Marguerite Porete died because she insisted that women were human beings with inherent dignity and worth. She was murdered because she refused to accept that her gender made her naturally inferior. She was executed because she dared to suggest that women's souls were equal to men's souls in the eyes of God. But here's the most heartbreaking part of Marguerite's story. Her execution achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. The message was received loud and clear by women across Europe. The price of defiance was death by fire. The cost of thinking too highly of yourself was public torture and execution. The penalty for refusing to accept your role as property was to be destroyed in the most horrific way possible. For centuries after Marguerite's death, her name was synonymous with the dangers of female pride and rebellion. Church sermons used her execution as an example of what happened to women who forgot their place. Her book was added to the Index of Forbidden Works, and possessing a copy became grounds for charges of heresy.